The idea that banks should not be able to create money from thin air starts from a wrong premise in my view, which is that banks create money from thin air, which they don't. If they did, none of them would go bust. Banks create money coming from projects that some of them are successful, some of them will be unsuccessful, and the balance between those that are successful repay their interest and their capital and come back to order and to request more capital becomes the word that we all strive for, which is progress. That is economic progress, and that has been the source of the largest improvement in wealth and means of activity for everybody in the world. So the idea that the system is imperfect is absolutely correct. The system has to be imperfect, because if we ignore the importance of the interaction between different economic agents with different periods of maturity, with different levels of risk, with different perceptions of value, then obviously we would be looking at a utopia that is impossible to achieve. The system cannot be perfect, and it should not be perfect, because one of the driving factors of progress, apart from credit, is capital destruction and creative destruction. Without creative destruction, today we would not have technology giants. Without the collapse of Enron, we would not have today Google. So it is absolutely imperative that when we look at the imbalances created in the monetary system, we look first at the benefits, and then we look at whether those imbalances are generated by the private banking sector or they are created by a central planning system. Do banks really behave stupidly? Do they really decide to lend aggressively to families or to businesses in order to go bust? Well, no, obviously not. The idea that banks take too much risk because of some evil conspiracy between thousands and thousands of privately owned entities makes absolutely no sense. The reason why banks take more risk in lending to housing is not because they're stupid and they decide to take risk on things that are expected to be very risky, but because they believe that they have no risk or very little risk. The last thing that you stop paying is a mortgage. House prices never go down. The reason why banks accumulate risk in long-term sovereign bonds is not because they're stupid, it's because they believe that they have no risk. Who tells them that they have no risk? The state. Who tells you that housing is a tremendous investment that has very little risk? Who tells you to accumulate risk in subprime mortgages? The guarantee of the state. It's not that subprime mortgages were being accumulated by investors and given an A+ rating simply because they were people were being too aggressive and taking too much risk because they wanted to, but because they believed that they had very little risk thanks to the support and the guarantee of the state. That's why Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were public entities that provided that guarantee. So, if we think of the monetary imbalances that have been built over the past decades, we need to think of what is the cause and what is a consequence. The cause is not the banks. Banks are like the fever when you're ill. No? You're not ill of fever, it's a consequence. It's a manifestation of a risk. But that risk is not built because banks all at the same time decide to take exactly the same risk and in the same level or almost the same level of accumulation. There has to be a driving force. And the only driving force that can lead to banks generating too much credit or above what is perceived as risk is government decisions, is central bank decisions. It's interesting to see that there is a view that central banks have to manipulate interest rates. No, central banks don't have to manipulate interest rates, and governments don't have to intervene. Governments intervene banks because they want to, not because they have to. Governments intervene in interest rates because they benefit from it. Money creation is never neutral. The utopical idea that you're going to create money that is going to be evenly spread out to the economy and everybody's going to benefit at the same time is false. Money creation is never neutral. It always disproportionately benefits the first recipient of money, which is government, and it always disproportionately negatively impacts the last recipient of money, which is real wages and deposit savings. It is always a transfer of wealth between wages and deposits to the most leveraged part of the economy, which is the state. And obviously the idea that one entity that consumes between 48 to 59% of the GDP of a country, which is the state, is going to accept to reduce its imbalances in a period of high inflation because money creation has been too aggressive prior, doesn't happen. And it has never happened. And the good thing about things that never happen is that they don't. Whether we like it or not, whether we want to like it, we want to like the idea that monopolies work. Monopolies don't work. They never work. Monopolies can only exist if the government implements it. So the idea that you're going to correct the imbalances, the challenges, the boom and bust cycles with a monopoly in the creation of money makes absolutely no sense. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. If we start by the idea, it is exactly the same as saying that, well, businesses are producing too much and therefore there's a working capital build and therefore all production should be nationalized. It is exactly the same. It is exactly the same as saying to businesses that they're doing things incorrectly and that the state is going to do them properly, which is not the case, and it's never going to be the case. Fiscal policy and monetary policy are exactly two sides of the same coin. They're the same thing. Let's imagine 2020, in which money growth exploded because of a decision from central banks and from governments to implement a radical new way of dealing with a crisis. It was deemed a supply shock crisis, therefore let's pump massively quantities of money and let's spend massively in order to protect people. The inflationary burst, Boria et al., shows that it came directly from the increase in money supply and the direct monetization of government spending, as Mr. Condon, Professor Condon and Castaneda also mentioned. So, it's not just that. It's that let's assume what happens afterwards if there's an entire monopoly in the creation of money. Let's think about this. This already happened. Yeah? This was an extraordinary event in which the government and the central banks decided to take extraordinary actions because of an extraordinary issue. What would happen in 2021? The monopoly in the creation of money would say, hey, inflation has gone through the roof. We should reduce the quantity of money in the system. Phenomenal. How do you do it? Because 59% of the economy is saying, I'm not cutting spending, which is the government. What happens? You don't reduce the quantity of money. You cannot reduce the quantity of money. Furthermore, the only way in which you reduce the quantity of money is by creating a private sector depression, which then brings the government back to the fore to tell that it has to prevent the crisis, spending more. What happens? Argentina, my friends. This is exactly what Argentina did 70 years ago. A country with enormous human capital, with a very diverse financial system, with an incredibly open economy, with everything that you would want to have in an emerging market economy. It wasn't even an emerging market economy. It was the seventh most productive economy in the world. It is exactly that. Is the moment in which the central bank and the government is intertwined and has the entire control of money supply. The government is never going to reduce its imbalances. Look at what our esteemed colleague presented. Said, well, the government will not have to run a deficit and massively enter into debt, of course, because it'll pass the imbalances to citizens via monetary debasement, which is the only way in which you can do it. Furthermore, if we think that there are tremendous imbalances too in the monetary system, and we look at all those imperfections, the way to improve those imperfections is not through higher regulation, higher intervention, and nationalization, and building a monopoly, but the opposite. We may argue that the problem that we have, if there is a problem, I would not categorize it as a problem. I would categorize as a problem to have a crisis in the 17th century. Because when you had a crisis in the 17th century, you would have 1, 2 every 20, 30 years, but it would last for 7 years or 10 years. So it's true that we now have more financial crisis, but it is also true, as the IMF has shown in numerous papers, that they are much shorter and less impacting on citizens. And they're actually less impacting every time, if you think about it. We have just passed the financial crisis with Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic, and virtually nobody even remembers the name of the second bank. Exactly, you do, but because you're very knowledgeable. But ask the average citizen. Ask the average citizen in Europe that they have seen 3 banking crises in the last 5 years, and they have not even noticed. So, of course, there are negative implications. But the idea that making it a monopoly is going to generate an improvement not only creates an absurdity, which is the fact itself that there is no such thing as a viable monopoly, but the reality that all of the incentives to generate inflation will be built in the government side. Of course, you can say that the central bank is independent and can force the government to reduce its expenditure. Be my guest. Be my guest in enforcing that. Because there is no single moment in history, in the monetary history. I recommend you to read Money, the History of Money, the book. It's no moment in history in which that has happened. So this leads us to a much more important element, which is how do we reduce the boom and bust cycles? The boom and bust cycles are not created by evil corporations trying to make too much money in very little time and leave the problems to the rest. Boom and bust cycles are created by the view from central planners that they know what is demanded by the economy, despite having no real evidence of what is like that. For example, in a lockdown, cutting rates. Who on earth told anyone that bringing down rates was going to lead people to take more credit, invest more, etc., while we're all at home miserably watching Netflix series all day? It's stupid, yet they did it. So the idea that central banks are going to err on the side of caution in itself is a mistake. But the idea that central banks and governments in monopoly are going to err on the side of caution is simply impossible. Even the most prudent and well-intentioned government is going to increase its imbalances in order to pass them to the consumer because it believes that it's doing a good job for everybody else. Which brings us to central bank digital currencies. What a great idea, no? Let's put money Let's put our money in a central bank account. Therefore, the transmission mechanism of monetary policy will be immediate. What does the transmission mechanism of monetary policy being immediate mean? Inflation is created faster. Period. That is it. Words disguise intentions. So, the transmission mechanism of monetary policy and the idea that monetary policy is going to be neutral is false from the start and the premise of the fact that government weighs between 38% to 59% of the GDP of an economy. It is always going to disproportionately benefit government. It's a crowding out of monster proportions. Think about this. Money creation is only generated by a monopoly, and then the banking sector leads with the risk of lending to the private sector. What is going to happen with interest rates to the private sector? What happens with the monetization of deficit from the government? It's passed. So you're basically passing the imbalances of government twice to the private sector. On the one hand, through much higher interest rates to the private sector, which has to deal with being financed by the private banking, while the government is financed by thin air, because the only monetary authority that creates money out of thin air is a central bank. A bank creates money out of a project. A central bank creates money out of nothing. That is really nothing. Therefore, what is the big problem of central bank digital currencies? To start with, that you cannot create an instrument of such massive ramifications in the economy, giving it to an entity that already starts by having an enormous level of, let's say, question among financial institutions and among investors. If the central bank has been completely unable to manage inflation, completely unable to manage boom and bust cycles, and completely unable to manage the quantity of money properly, how on earth would we give it even more power to issue directly a digital currency? Second, central bank digital currencies, my friends, is surveillance disguised as money. It has absolutely nothing to do with money creation. It has everything to do with how you spend your money and where you spend it on. And therefore, coming back to the transmission mechanism, it is also a way of deciding where to create money according to the priorities or the ideology of the government and the central bank on its own. Furthermore, if the government spends too much and the central bank decides that there's too much cash in the system, central bank digital currency is a fantastic way of erasing your deposits out of your account because there's too many savings. The most idiotic concept in economy, excess savings. So, because excess savings means investment in the economy. So the idea of a central bank digital currency starts from central banks that don't have the benefit of doubt in terms of erring on the side of caution. And the problem of central bank digital currencies is also the one that I mentioned before, is that it exacerbates what is already a problem of crowding out of the public sector relative to the private sector. It is right now, in a period of hiking rates, when we are seeing how the entirety of the burden of the reduction in quantity and the increase in the cost of money is weighted on the shoulders of the private sector, not on the public sector. So de facto denationalization of the economy. If we want anything to do with improving the boom and bust cycles, we should actually read the book that was mentioned prior, Hayek's Choice in Currency, the denationalization of money. If anything, let's avoid the monopoly of issuing money. Let's give people the choice. Why not have an Amazon currency? Why not have a Facebook currency? By the way, it was almost launched, but then somebody... So the key element here is that we don't need more intervention. that governments are not, and the central banks are not intervening because they have to. They intervene, they create a problem, and then they present themselves as the solution. And if we need anything in the financial system, it's more competition and more openness, not less. And certainly not provide a digital currency to central banks that have been completely unable to manage boom and bust cycles, inflation, and the imbalances of the public sector. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.